Let's talk about the worst fighting between Israelis and Palestinians in a long time. The Gaza Strip is a war zone. Battered by days of Israeli air attacks and artillery, children have been killed, homes have been pulverized, tens of thousands of people left with nowhere to go. Israeli civilians have been killed too, but far fewer than the Palestinians. And in neighborhoods across Israel and the occupied West Bank, people have turned on each other. But this bloodshed goes back a long time.
What's being referred to as an escalation violence didn't start with Gaza.
So where did it start? What is this fight all about? And how does it end? Before we get into it, let's take a moment to get a sense of the scale of the human cost. At the time we recorded this, nearly 200 Palestinians, including more than 50 children, had been killed by Israeli attacks on Gaza. More than 1,000 Palestinians wounded. At least 10 people in Israel, including 2 children, have been killed by rockets fired from Gaza, and more than 250 wounded. And in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, at least 19 Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured by Israeli security forces.
Civilian, vulnerable people are the most affected at the moment.
Though it might look on TV sometimes as computer games, this is computer games with real people, which pay with death and injuries and devastation.
So how did we get here? Well, we're going to focus on what happened when and where over the last few weeks. Here's Gaza. It's where the worst violence has happened, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Gaza is part of the occupied Palestinian territories that also include East Jerusalem and the West Bank. They're called occupied because Israel took them by force after the Six-Day War in 1967. Now let's look at occupied East Jerusalem. The Old City is there and includes sites considered holy by Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And this is the Damascus Gate. It's one of the entry points into the Old City. It's also where things started heating up in April. At the beginning of Ramadan, Israeli forces put up fences there. They said it was to prevent crowding, but Palestinians felt they were being kept out deliberately. Another example of Israel making them feel like the city isn't theirs. Eventually, the fences were removed, but there were several nights of fighting between unarmed protesters and Israeli forces. Not far from the Damascus Gate, and also in occupied East Jerusalem, is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. There have been a series of court cases there since the 1970s over who owns certain homes. In May, an Israeli court said that several Palestinian families should be forced out, ruling in favor of an association of Israeli settlers.
They represent probably some of the most radical, extreme settlers. They, at the end of the day, believe it all belongs to them.
So people came out to protest. Israeli security forces cracked down, while some settlers provoked Palestinians.
You are stealing my house!
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
The case is now with the Israeli Supreme Court, but the justices have postponed their hearing. Now remember, Sheikh Jarrah is an occupied territory in East Jerusalem, and international law, not Israeli law, is supposed to apply. So for Palestinians, what the settlers and Israeli courts are doing is plain theft. The UN says it may even be a war crime.
The evictions, if ordered and implemented, would violate Israel's obligations under international law.
But the Israeli government sees it very differently and argues that Israel has the authority to do what it wants in Jerusalem.
ירושלים היא בירת ישראל, וכפי שכל עם בונה בבירתו ואת בירתו, גם לנו שמורה הזכות לבנות בירושלים ואת ירושלים.
And this is why Sheikh Jarrah became such a focus of Palestinian anger, because Jerusalem is not Israel's capital according to the vast majority of the international community. How the city is ultimately shared between Israel and a future Palestinian state still has to be negotiated. But while this doesn't happen, Israel is changing things on the ground. And Palestinians feel that what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah is part of a much larger pattern of annexation and dispossession.
This has happened across Palestine, where Israel allows itself to appropriate land and houses on a really false legal pretext.
So let's bring up our map again. Israeli forces were cracking down on protesters in Sheikh Jarrah for several days. Then on May 7th, in the Old City, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were at the final Friday prayers of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam. Afterwards, there were protests in the Old City, but Israeli forces raided the mosque's compound. They threw stun grenades and fired rubber-coated steel bullets at Palestinians, some of whom were throwing stones, and it spiraled from there. By the following Monday, there was tear gas inside the mosque itself.
To see it laid siege to was incredibly emotional for a lot of people around the world.
This is where Gaza comes back in. It's a small strip of land where nearly 2 million Palestinians are crammed in. They can't get out easily because for the last 14 years, Israel has imposed a land, air, and sea blockade. And Gaza is run by Hamas, a Palestinian group that Israel and the US consider terrorists. Now, after all the violence in East Jerusalem, the top commander of Hamas warned Israel that it had until 6 p.m. that Monday to withdraw its security forces from the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. When the deadline passed, Hamas fired rockets into central Israel, and Israel's military attacked. They destroyed this building after warning people inside to leave. Then Hamas responded again.
This is a wave after wave of attacks coming out of Gaza now. These rockets are heading in the direction of Tel Aviv.
From there, it just got worse. Relentless air attacks by the Israelis and thousands of rockets launched by Hamas. Most of those rockets were shot down by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. But in Gaza, there's nothing like that.
Reports continue of families, women, children, and infants killed in their homes by airstrikes.
One Israeli attack hit a refugee camp, killing 2 women and 8 children from the same family. Several buildings were targeted, including one that housed the offices of international media, like the Associated Press and Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera's offices are, there we are, another strike on that tower. And the tower has come down.
The impact will be to reduce the flow of information coming from Gaza.
Israel says it's only targeting fighters and military assets, and it accuses Hamas of hiding them among civilians and in residential buildings. But here's the thing about Gaza.
When you bomb a densely populated area such as Gaza, there are going to be civilian casualties no matter what.
With all this going on in Gaza, over in Israel and the occupied West Bank, we've been seeing something we rarely see. Thousands of Palestinian citizens of Israel taking to the streets in towns, villages, and what are known as mixed cities to assert their identity and rights. But it has also seemed to trigger some Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis to start attacking each other. There are many horrible videos posted online of Arabs being beaten up in the street, businesses smashed in, and vehicles, and a synagogue set on fire.
It's the worst between communities living alongside each other in decades.
So how does this all end? Well, a ceasefire for Gaza is the first essential step, and the UN, Egypt, and Qatar have all been involved in international mediation efforts to make that happen.
We also urge them to allow us as a humanitarian to move and to provide our emergency response.
A ceasefire is only the beginning, because events over the last few weeks are set against a backdrop of decades in which the Israeli government has denied Palestinians their basic rights. It's a system that Human Rights Watch and others have described as apartheid.
They are not equal or full citizens. Indeed, they're incredibly marginalized and discriminated against.
The US, as Israel's most important ally, has a special role to play in this. People are looking to President Joe Biden to see whether he'll say or do things differently from previous administrations. He hasn't so far.
My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory.
But we've been here before, and to avoid being here again, something has to change.
The only way that this will end is with full decolonization, Palestinian liberation.
The divide is not necessarily right now between Jews and Arabs. It's between those who believe that can be a coexistence, reconciliation, that the two people can live in peace in the same land, respecting each other, and those who don't think like this.
Right now, that idea of peaceful coexistence may seem impossibly far off, but the answer can't be to just keep going like this. Hopefully that was a useful starting point, but obviously there is so much more context to this story. On AlJazeera.com, we've got data interactives, plenty of analysis, and a live blog with all the latest. I'll see you next week.